Business Insider Live. I'm here with best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell. He has written a lot about race and policing, and the latest season of his podcast, Revisionist History, comes out today. So, Malcolm, let's start with the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the things they're calling for is defunding the police and essentially allotting funds to other institutions. What do you think of this? What are the pros and cons here?
Well, I am 100% with them that this is the time for systematic restructuring of law enforcement in the United States. It's long overdue. I just don't know. I'd rather figure out the funding part after we figure out what we want to do.
Now, you talk about what policing looks like right now in your book, Talking to Strangers, which was one of the most read nonfiction books on Amazon in the first week of June. You start with Sandra Bland, an African-American woman who was pulled over in Texas in 2015, arrested by the police, and days later she was found hanging in her cell. You have a theory about why this happened in your book. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I tried to look at that case from a number of different perspectives, and the one that I spent the most time on was understanding why is it that police engage in these kinds of routine traffic stops to the extraordinary extent that they do in the United States, and why it is that a police officer would approach someone for the most trivial of reasons and come very swiftly to a conclusion that there was an erroneous conclusion, that there was criminal behavior involved. And the answer to both those questions is that this is an outcome of this isn't a bad racist cop, although he may well have been racist, I have no idea. But this specific situation is an outgrowth of a theory and strategy of law enforcement, which has been enacted at the highest level in many areas of the United States over the last generation.
And is there room for race as a factor in this argument?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. I don't think you could take race out of almost any discussion of any pathological situation in America. It is the stain that runs through every part of this country's fabric. But I think very often those kinds of attitudes become institutionalized. They become part of broader systems. And so if you want to understand how racism operates on a daily level, you have to go beyond simply peering into someone's hearts and saying, do you or do you not like Black people? No. It's like racism gets enshrined into zoning ordinances and tax rules and a million different in who and when and how people vote. I mean, there are all kinds of systematic ways in which racism is enshrined in this country. And what I want to do is to get us to think about the problem, not just me. Many people now are, I think, appropriately saying, let's think about the problem on that level.
Now, a theme in one of your other books, David and Goliath, is that civil societies only work when citizens see governing bodies as legitimate. Have police forces across the US failed to inspire this legitimacy? And what are some of the problems why, or reasons why?
Well, one thing that I would say before I go any further is that it is impossible to generalize about police departments in the United States. There are, I think I'm right, 18,000 police departments in the United States. Exceptional people and are exceptionally well run and are, and some are at the opposite end of the spectrum. We can no more generalize about police in the United States than we can generalize about doctors or teachers or nurses or firefighters. So I think it's very important to be more specific. So have the police as a whole lost legitimacy? No. I live in a little rural area of upstate New York. Every encounter I've ever had with police here has been respectful and courteous and satisfactory. I don't have any issues with them. They don't have any issues with me, right? I suspect a large number of Americans feel exactly the same way. However, there are clearly communities in this country where there has been a complete breakdown of legitimacy. So our task is to identify what are those communities that are in trouble and how do we fix them. But you know, this, just because there are a bunch of doctors who commit malpractice doesn't mean that you scrap the entire healthcare system and decertify every doctor, right? I think that's an important point that bears repeating at this time.
In your books, you take a very scientific approach, which you're taking with policing as well, to explain why things are the way they are in this world. So, what
Mhm.
is your analytical assessment of this chaotic moment in time with protests and the pandemic? Is this some sort of a tipping point?
Well, at the moment, it's the short answer. The boring answer is it's too early to tell. But I would say that I'm encouraged that, to me, the central issue is after one of these issues happens, do we talk about the specifics of the issue and make it sound like this is just about a bunch of bad apples and it's a personal beef between two people or it's one bad cop gone wrong? Or do we start talking about systems and cultures and it struck me that very early on, after George Floyd, we were talking about systems and cultures. And that's super encouraging because that's the conversation that we have to have if we're going to clear up this mess. So if that is going to be our guide, that does suggest to me that something very different is happening now with the way we approach this issue.
That's great. Turning to your podcast, Revisionist History, where you re examine things that are overlooked or misunderstood, season 5 comes out today. What can we expect? What are some themes you're tackling?
Oh, it's a fun one. This season, the general theme is I'm interested in our attachment to things. So the objects, ideas, and how those attachments lead us awry. So I begin with this strange digression into the weird world of art museums, and I go from there. I have a whole thing about um, is about a guy who wants to reform the way student council presidents are chosen, which is a kind of allegory for our electoral system. A 4-part series on a very, very important general in the Second World War who makes one of the most fateful decisions of the Second World War, Curtis LeMay. Um, I have a whole thing about crazy thing about Howard Hughes. I mean, it's just like all seasons of revisionist history, it is all over the map. The only thing that ties all the episodes together, I think, is that they are either thought provoking or a whole lot of fun, and hopefully both.
What are you finding that you can do with the podcast medium that you can't really do with a book?
Well, because we're talking about um, we're talking about voices and hearing, not words and seeing. You know, the your ears are you feel with your ears. Sounds are incredibly emotional. Hearing someone's voice is a wholly different um, experience than reading their words. So podcasts allow you, I think, to tap into something that is emotionally far more meaningful. Um, and that's something that I've discovered in my 5 years of doing revisionist history. And it's guided a lot of the work that I'm doing. That it's a different, there are certain things I think that are best done in print, things that are analytical, complex, that involve numbers, involve lots of multi-layered logical arguments. That's print. But podcasts are for moving people, for getting them to know people, uh, uh, or creating some kind of powerful sympathetic response. That's what podcasts are for.
Just so you know, I actually listen to your books rather than read them because I find it easier to go through the whole, like, absorb the analytical aspect of it,
Mm.
because of the very thing you said about it
Yeah,
being more emotive, for sure.
yeah,
Um,
it's right.
let's talk about President Trump and the election. So, in an interview in 2016, I dug deep. You said he'll be in jail within a year. That hasn't happened. And a lot of us have been wrong when it comes to him.
I
Why
know.
is that?
Well, he turns out to be wilier and to have more enablers than I would have imagined. Can't think of another president, Democratic or Republican, who could have done what Trump has done and gotten away with it. But somehow he has, and I don't have a good explanation. I think people have just been willing to look the other way or to excuse him. It certainly helps that almost no one, with few exceptions, almost no members of his own party in the Senate in particular have been willing to stand up to him. If your own party is backing you, you can kind of keep going, so that's been a little sobering lesson in how politics works. But so yeah, I'm hopeful that that the Senate and the Congress returns to its proper role as people who serve to as placing a check on the presidency. I mean, and not being simply the president's lapdog.
Do you have any political predictions for November?
I am smart in only one respect, and that is I'm smart enough not to.
So, one of your other books, Outliers, has one of my favorite quotes: "Who we are cannot be separated from where we're from." Have you found that to be true in your own life and experiences?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think when you understand the extent to which as human beings we are products of our culture, environment, upbringing, influences, that we're rooted in the world and what we grow up in, then I think that helps us understand who people are. In my own life, I grew up in Canada. If you don't understand me, you have to understand that fact. My mom is Jamaican. Crucial fact. My dad was English. Crucial fact. I'm the product of, Southern Ontario public schools. Crucial fact. Like all these things, don't tell you the whole story about who I am, but they help you kind of put the pieces together. Why do I have the positions I have? Well, part of that story lies in, a couple dozen facts of the sort I've just shared with you. And I'm someone who believes that people are much more usefully explained by those kinds of contextual details than they are by simply looking at people in isolation.
The pandemic is something that none of us could have imagined in some ways. Are there any sort of conclusions you've come to about human behavior as a whole?
Well, I mean, I've learned that how ill prepared we were for this kind of thing, that I think we were naive about the risk that this sort of viral epidemic could pose to the way we run our economies. So I think in that sense, it's woken us up to our complacency. I have been impressed by the ability of the medical community to respond to this crisis, and how swiftly we have, gone about developing vaccines and better treatments and learning about this disease. So I've been heartened by the kind of expert response and disheartened by the social and political response.
Before we wrap up, Malcolm, what are you reading right now or listening to that you would recommend to our viewers?
Oh my, what a good question. Well, what have I been? While we're on the subject of the pandemic, there is a really amazing podcast called TWIV, This Week in Virology, which has been going on for years and years and years. But it's a bunch of prominent virologists talk about the issues of the day in their world. And they've been talking about COVID, obviously, for the last couple of months. And it's an extraordinary education in the nature of this pandemic. So I would recommend TWIF, This Week in Virology. Recommend it without hesitation.
Awesome. Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us. And just a reminder that the latest season of Revisionist History comes out today.